Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Greg Peters, Senior Vice President, PreSales and Customer Success at Alteryx. The topic of today's episode is justifying PreSales headcount. I don't care if you're an IC, you're a frontline leader, you're a worldwide leader. The topic of justifying headcount and justifying PreSales existence has been ongoing from the start of this profession. Although it's not as straightforward as many of us might hope, the idea of justifying our existence can be quite difficult and tough to do. And so in today's episode, Greg is going to walk us through his years and years of experience justifying PreSales headcount. You're also going to hear Greg's perspective on my title of justification. It's really interesting because Greg gives us very, very concrete details in terms of data to use, metrics to use, and ways to go about making sure that when you're justifying this 2021 headcount, you're in a position to get exactly what you need. Enjoy today's episode. Greg, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How's it going today?
Pretty awesome, man. I appreciate you having me here, and excited to chat and work with you guys more.
Glad that you're here. I really appreciate you sparing time during a busy Q4 to join the podcast. I know it's busy right now. I mean, I can imagine someone in your position, you're closing out the year, you're planning for FY21 at this point. It's got to be pretty chaotic.
It can be. You just got to keep your eye on what's coming and try not to get too riled up about stuff. You know, you get a lot of the teams and they're like, hey, what's the plan for next year? And I don't even have the plan yet. I start to formulate it, but I'm waiting on the proverbial rubber stamp from finance. So just try not to get too wrapped around the axle and keep the team moving forward and making sure that those opportunities come in.
Especially in 2020, it's been such an interesting year for everybody. Have you done anything different in terms of your management style with your org, to compensate for the year of not meeting customers and not doing things as traditionally?
An interesting year is, I think, putting it mildly. If I think about the year, I never thought I would say I miss being on a plane so much.
I'm with you for sure on that.
I've always been a road warrior, not for sake of love to travel, but I believe in being in front of the teams. And the only way that I can connect with the teams is being face to face. And in the midst of this year, it did pose a lot of new challenges. And I had to adjust to a degree my leadership style. Make yourself more available to the teams, break down the barriers of that proverbial glass house. Like, you got to break that glass house, reach out to the teams, be vulnerable with them, talk to them like a human being, let them know that you're there for them. And so, sometimes it could be a little uncomfortable, but it's really, if you want people to feel connected, you got to try different things and see what works.
I like the just being human aspect. I think that's really been a big key for 2020. Greg, before we get into today's episode, which I'm really excited about, because I think it's something that is top of mind for all pre-sales leaders, whether you're a frontline manager or you're leading a global organization, I'm excited to talk about headcount. However, before we get there, you've been in pre-sales for quite some time. So tell us how you got into pre-sales. What's your story?
That goes back a long time, 20 years probably. I think early in my career, I was an intern analyst at, AT&T. And Business Objects comes along at the time. And I happened to, when I was at AT&T, I installed this revolutionary product back in 1998. I think it was 32 floppy disks, and then got it up and running. And at the time, pre-sales engineer that I didn't know, a pre-sales engineer said, how did you get that running? We can't even get it running. I said, I don't know. I just figured it out. I started looking around. They're like, you want a job? Business Objects time was a real small company, French-based, I think about 400 people or so. And I went into services, not pre-sales, services. I thought that was going to be really cool, but I found services. Not a fan. Didn't like being on site 5 to 6 days a week, same thing, day in and day out. And one day, a good friend of mine who was a pre-sales engineer said, have you thought about the dark side? And I said, dark side? Yeah, in sales. So they said, you're a heck of a lot more personable than being in services. It'd be a lot more fun. So I stepped into it, and I really never looked back. And I think the hardest adjustment initially was making that leap from services to pre-sales. And the way I can analogize it, if you think of services builds out the infrastructure, the inside of the home. Pre-sales are all about the Hollywood. right? The outward facing approach. Don't step more than a foot inside the door because we don't have it built out, but you got to be okay to decouple that. And I know a good friend of mine, a mentor at the time, someone, we're in front of a customer and they're like, hey, how do you get this data out of the database? And the services side of me pulls up SQL Server Enterprise Manager. And my buddy who's pre-sales, he kind of elbows me. He's like, what the fudge are you doing? He's like, use the damn product to show him the data. And I was like, oh yeah. The rest is history. But I think pre-sales is absolutely one of the greatest jobs on the planet because you do different things. It's never mundane. It'll see different customers, business problems, use cases, good sellers, bad sellers. And it's just an exciting place to be. And again, I absolutely love it. Involved in the leadership, stepped in, stepped out for a change and found a long time ago. And that I absolutely love just building teams and love the coaching, mentoring, and development of folks. And there's nothing more that gets me up in the morning than seeing, someone's face light up. You're coaching them, actually help them get to where they want to be. And that's my reward in it. But I absolutely love what I do.
I love that. And I love hearing that. I mean, you're right. The Lightbulb Moment generally is why so many people do pre-sales, but you said it in the context of actually our employees, bettering our employees, having them have that Lightbulb Moment with the customers. And that's what it's all about. So appreciate you giving back. I'm really excited again to talk about today's episode. And just for the listeners, we went back and forth on the title of this podcast. And your thought was like, hey, I don't know how much I love this, but that's why I wanted to attack it head on. So the topic of today's podcast is justifying pre-sales headcount. I think we probably can agree, and most people listening, that it's still kind of a little bit BS that we still have to go through the justification for this role that we do after years and years of proven success. But today, you're going to be really providing us some insights into something that you've done really well in your career, which is actually the justification and really connecting with finance and getting into those details. So I'm going to ask you the first question. We're just going to hit this head on. You've been in pre-sales for quite some time. Why does the profession generally still have trouble justifying the existence of pre-sales?
I wasn't a fan of that term because I feel like it's coming from the glass is half empty instead of half full. If you think about you're asking for headcount and you go to finance and you're asking for it, what finance hears is money going out the door. And I think a lot of folks make the mistake of not putting yourself in the finance's shoes and understand that you're not money going out the door. You need to show them how money is coming back in. What's the ROI? And kind of the other part of it too is I'm reminiscent and almost sometimes I have a tough time saying it, but I found that there are parts of the organizations, wherever you work at, that really don't know what pre-sales does. And I think the old adage, if you don't like your relationship with somebody, own it. That's not their fault. It's our fault, as a pre-sales collective for not doing a better job and highlighting what we do. If you think about it, we're really like the jack of all trades. There's not much that comes our way that we don't know how to do or we figure it out. We're just a team that gets shit done no matter what. You get a lot thrown at us. So maybe sometimes there is the element of doing less with more, but we do so much with less, right? That it's like, they'll figure it out. But you need to really put yourself in finance's shoes and come with the data to back it. And I've seen pre-sales leaders either not have a way to measure pre-sales metrics. And I remember my days back at SAP, and it was very much the big brother pre-sales metrics. You had to account for 38 to 40 hours. And if you didn't, you were put on the naughty board. And that incented bad behavior, right? You would just log hours to put your numbers up there. And that, I think, in the early days really set like pre-sales metrics off on the wrong foot. And it's up to us as pre-sales leaders that you have to tell the team the why. Why is more important than the what. And I think a lot of us make the mistake of saying, enter your time, but we don't do a good job at explaining why, what's it used for. So pretty much everything that I do, I make it available to the team so they can see, like justifying headcount, the conversations I have with sales leaders. I use it in a lot of sales calls and QBRs. Like I refer to that data. People will ask, where did you get that? Well, that's just because you entered your time. It's not about just entering the time, it's all the value that comes out of it. You need to think about ways of incenting the team to enter that time as well, right? Because if you don't get the time entered, then it's kind of pointless. So what's the biggest carrot for pre-sales? President's Club, right? There are some years I just want to completely get rid of President's Club because it causes so much contention and fighting for this dollar and that dollar. We can talk about that later on, but President's Club is the carrot that if you want President's Club and you can be on the leaderboard and recognize your revenue contribution among things, you need to enter your time. And the latency of that time is important. So I think I've been around the block a time or two and you see all sorts of, I wouldn't say like guilty, but like people, like, I don't even want to say gaming, but it's almost like there hasn't been the guide rails there. And so we created ways to do things, right? So you need to have some of those guidelines in place, but kind of President's Club, and you work backwards from there and you message it, remessage it. But that data is incredibly important at the opportunity level to determine what's the cost of sale, the true cost of sale. How much time do you spend on an opportunity on average by revenue band, depending on how you align your teams, whether they inside teams, mid-market teams, enterprise teams, strategic teams. Each of those sales cycles can be different. And so that'll help you determine the cost of sale. What's your win-loss rate? And another metric that I look at that helps the teams with their focus is we can't say for every hour we put in equals $1 of revenue, but we can say the amount of time and effort we put in should yield an ROI for the company. And so I encourage, leaders and teams, and then don't use this as you're bad or you're good, but think about for the activities that you're working on, are you increasing or decreasing your revenue per hour generation for the company? If you're decreasing, you should be asking yourself, why are we doing this? If you're increasing, let's do more of it. So you got to try to think about what is the ROI that we bring back to the company and your sales partners. And I get really passionate about this stuff and maybe I go off on tangents. So feel free to rope me back in.
Lots of good stuff here, Greg. Lots of good stuff. Lots of things to unpack. I actually want to take a little bit of a step back because on a previous episode of PreSales Podcast, Halda Sebanova was on the podcast. And what she did at her organization is she created something called PreSales Talks, which was a week-long conference to raise awareness to her 9,000 person company to what pre-sales is, what we do, and why we exist. I thought that was very innovative that she had done that. And I actually was a speaker, which I really enjoyed because I got to see how this event went. Beyond something like that, what are some ways in the past that you've essentially helped to raise awareness of the pre-sales team, whether it's to finance, whether it's to operations, to make sure that they know, like the example that you said, who we are and what we do?
So there's kind of a number of things. One is I can't encourage the leaders enough to go build relationships, not just with those they immediately work with, but those in finance, those in other departments, other organizations. And building those relationships makes life insanely easier to get things done. But finance in particular, because finance generally is pretty black and white. They're ones and zeros. And you have to really foster that relationship with them to get on their level so you can build trust. I made it a mission to go build a relationship with my CFO. And, it turns out he's actually a great guy. He's actually a pretty cool guy, and you got to find out what makes people tick. He likes watches and cars and science fiction movies, right? And it's not just you go to them superficially, because I vehemently disagree with that. You just go to talk to people, right? Like they're human beings. And I think in the last 3 years, I might have asked one or two things of the CFO. You got to build those relationships and it helps people understand what you do. The other is, I'm a big advocate of building political capital. And what I mean by that is, go around the organizations and do they need help? Do they see as there business problems going on that they could use a pre-sales resource to help them internally? I've helped the expense organization. We all know expenses can be, if you don't know them, grind you over $5 or $10, right? And cause you a lot of pain and misery. Lo and behold, if you happen to be the team that helps out expenses a lot, They help you through the process, or accounts payable, or again, other organizations. So I encourage you, it shouldn't be no, it's, hey, how can I help? You'll start to be known as the team that just gets shit done. If you need something, go to the pre-sales team. They can help you. And so by building that political capital, it's huge. And really building the relationships, and in turn, you're educating, what people do. And don't be afraid to get out on company events or internal meetings. Like, ask for time. Highlight what your team does. The things just don't land in your lap, right? Hey, to win the lottery, you got to go down to the store and put the dollar, right? Pay the dollar, right? Magically, people aren't just going to know what pre-sales does if you don't put some effort into it.
I want to dive in on the metrics aspect, right? You talked a lot about metrics earlier and some items about creating company ROI. So can you expand on what specifically that you're looking at when you're justifying headcount, and talk about some of these company ROI aspects?
You got to have the data to back it. The data comes from pre-sales metrics tied to opportunities. So you got to have all that in place. And what I've taken a look at is I did this globally by region, and then at the sales column group level. And within there's the different lines of business sales teams. And so what I've done in the past is I took what was the total average time per opportunity an SC spent in the prior 12 months, and what was the total average revenue that was gained from those. And then I said, okay, what can I do with this now? I said, all right, if you have a full-time employee at 2,000 hours, you back out roughly 30% for admin, PTO, training, things like that. That leaves 70%, or I think roughly about 1,400 hours that somebody could work on opportunities. And if they were flat out to establish the baseline, you take the average time and you take the flat out time, and that will give you the total opportunities if they were 100% utilized that they could influence. And then you can extrapolate what is the total opportunity dollars that they could impact. Now, you and I both know the reality of somebody being 100% utilized the entire year is not realistic. I looked at like a 50% win rate, because you got close one time, close lost time. Got 50% of that, right? That's X amount of opportunities, X amount of dollars. Then the key is you take the seller average quota. So you take the seller average quota on the per team, per region basis. And with what can be impacted, that will drive to the overall ratios. And that is, you can take that concretely to finance or whoever, and you can show of what the data is telling you of what the ratio should be like. Now, if you don't have good data collection, this can bite you in the butt. So you really got to be methodical about it. So that's one way of being able to justify headcount. The other I came up with a couple years ago, and again, it depends on what the priorities of finance is. Sometimes I've seen the priorities of finances, they want less headcount. Sometimes they're conscious about cost. So you got to ask, and I'll flat out ask finance, is it a headcount thing or is it a cost thing? And they'll go, it's cost. And then my gears started turning, and I looked at, okay, if you have a midpoint salary band by SC type, by region, and you take the midpoint dollars, here is your cost. And if you can, again, I'm a big advocate of folks at a university, right, to help build your bench, right, with the right profile. And build your bench, you bring them in, and you can get more of them, right? Now there's going to be some pain initially of training and getting them up to speed just based on headcount, but they will be some just killer folks. And, we have just a killer team here that we're going to train, onboard, room, how to sell, the Alteryx way. You get just some killer talent, but you're able to get more SCs in and stay under cost. So that's a way more head, right? So be creative, like try different ways and be creative. Created other models of just shifting ratios around. Like, you got to try different things. No one way works for me every single year, right? So you just got to try to think outside the box and come up with different ways. Work with your finance team, work with your HR to, better understand what are the priorities of the organization and get the headcount that you're looking for.
I appreciate you breaking that down. And I love that you brought up the idea of headcount or cost. So many times in my career, especially in startups, I have had this argument around headcount and cost and having to hire very junior, inexperienced people, but people on the team that make double or triple that salary, right? So give me the option. Greg, can you tell me a time where you were essentially denied headcount, but you went back and rejustified and got that headcount? Because I feel like that's a situation that happens all the time.
As much as I'd like to say you could stab that off, it's hard to do, right? Oftentimes they look at it, hey, I could get, and I'm not saying it's the right thing, but I think it can be short-sighted. Hey, I can get one pre-sales, or I can get another quota carrier to bring in more quota. And depending on the sales leadership, depending on finance, they might say, let's get the quota carrier. And I would tell finance back in the day, we've gotten better. I said, look, you could have 1,000 quota carriers. If you don't have enough pre-sales staff, good luck. Product doesn't sell itself. You need the pre-sales team. So a lot of times, what I'll do too, how many times have you been, in an organization and the sales leader says, James, we don't have enough pre-sales, fix it. How many times you encounter that? What I do with that is I'll tell the sales leader, hey, bud, look, I want to help you. Trust me. My team is all about helping. Here's a hand that I've been dealt by finance. I have kicked, screamed, clawed, scratched, done everything humanly possible to get more headcount. But here's what I got. And what I've done is I got multiple sales leaders on a call before and say, guys, do you want this number of SCs in Latin America, or do you want them in the Americas? Because these are the pool of 10. Where do you want them to go? And they kind of figure it out on their own, right? And so I'm the good guy. I'm just like, guys, I want to help, but I can't squeeze blood from a turnip. So it's a way that instead of you being the bad guy, because we're not, we want to help, but just get so much headcount, go back to the sales leadership, and work it out.
I'm glad you brought this up because I knew that you would talk about finance, but I was wondering if you were going to talk about sales leadership. So how often do you utilize sales leadership to help make that justification?
All the time. Again, going back to building relationships is paramount. As pre-sales leaders, I think in past lives in my career, before I really embraced the relationship side of it, really need to do that. It is incredibly important because they got to know that you're a partner of theirs, right? And a partner doesn't mean just sitting there idle, but you're advocating for them. They're advocating for you. You guys are talking to each other. You're letting them know, hey, here's what's been given to me. How do you want to shake this out? I could use some help, put some pressure on whoever. Get them to help fight your battle. And they will oftentimes get to see what you're dealing with. So it's incredibly important that you are tied at the hip with your sales counterparts.
Greg, is there anything that I haven't asked you about when it comes to justifying headcount that you think people need to hear?
There's a number of things to think about, but why do you need it?
Pretty big deal, huh?
I've seen all too often times people are like, I need the headcount. Why? Why do you need it? Have a damn good reason. You got to think about if it were your company and money's going out the door and you're writing the check, do you really need it? And sometimes be a good steward and say, no, I don't. But put yourself in finance's shoes. And I think be collaborative with all the stakeholders around. Let them know, here's what your team does. Here's how you help. Here's what the value that you bring, rather than fighting that crusade. It can be a big challenge. There's a number of things, but the data is huge. Without data, you're not going to be able to uphold any upstanding conversation.
I appreciate that. And I think one thing that I want to add in here is that I got that advice early on in my career. So when I was building startups, I built a fairly sophisticated system on tracking. And a lot of people were like, this is overkill. And I was like, it's not overkill because I have every piece of data that has existed in this company for 4.5 years and how we've influenced it. I see a lot of things with PreSales Collective where people are just starting to get their data in, and you got to do it at some point. But recommendation I give to anybody is start with your data and start with your system of record, because once you have that from day one, it's much easier to talk about, hey, I need another headcount. And when your team's only 2 people or 3 people, you can make it happen.
I commend that you were, so engrossed in it and thought leader in it, because that should be one of their first priorities. If the pre-sales metrics system isn't in place, without that, you are not justifying any headcount. And it's not even just about the headcount. How do you know where your team is spending their time? I remember when I first took a look at some of the data here, and I really had to have a cadence around it because it was kind of haphazard. Some were entering it, some weren't. It's like, where does you spend your time and what stage of the sales cycle? What's the biggest bang for the buck for every hour we put in here? Your win rate goes up. And I found that the SCs were by and large spending a lot of time in discovery. Well, you also need to think about, why do reps want to leave stuff in stage 0 per se? That reduces the forecast ability, right? That means they sandbag. So I think it's important to the sales leaders to help with forecasting. Yes. So pre-sales metrics isn't just about for us and having those conversations. It's also to help the sales leaders too, because if you start entering your time and you see that a lot of this is in stage 0, they leave it there. You can have conversations with that. You can have conversations looking at, what are your win rates? Some of the metrics that I looked at after I got some data in was, okay, Mr. CFO, do you know that by region, by team, here were all the won opportunities, and that my team influenced about 60% of those won opportunities. And when my team was engaged, the deal was 6x larger than when we weren't. And when you start calling that stuff out, you can't refute that. When my team is pre-sales is engaged and it's 6x larger, who's going to refute that? And if next year, we're going to have, say, double the opportunities, my team can only impact so many of them. You want more revenue, more pre-sales. You got to get creative. And again, pre-sales metrics, it's not just about the headcount. And I think early in my career too, around pre-sales metrics, it had this big bad stigma to it. It was like Big Brother watching. And I made it very clear to my team here, I don't want them to account for 40 hours a week. All I want them to account customer time, marketing time, anything that can attribute to revenue. And if they want to enter PTO and all that stuff, have at it. But I don't want a Big Brother, because if you do Big Brother, you're getting poor quality. But they got to enter it within 2 weeks.
That's accurate and keeps it up to date. Greg, I've enjoyed this conversation. As you can start to tell at the end, I'm kind of nerding out on the data around pre-sales because I think it's great. I really enjoyed hearing your perspective. But before I let you go, I do have 2 things to ask you. The first one is, what's your favorite thing about the pre-sales role?
Man, that's a tough one because I love so much about it. I do love, watching people grow, mentor them and grow. But I also, on the flip side, in working with different customers, because we deal with so many different folks and different companies and different use cases, you have so much value to bring and help customers see the way that you see a customer light up. It's pretty awesome, right? And what you bring to customers when you're solving real world problems, it's pretty compelling. But there is just so much that we do that I just absolutely love. It's hard to call out one specific thing.
I think maybe that's it. Just wearing multiple hats, doing lots of things. You mentioned jack of all trades. We did a podcast episode about being a Swiss Army knife. So I like that. I appreciate that, Greg. Last question for you is, what advice do you have for people who are struggling to justify the headcount? I know we talked about it a lot, but if you can break it down into just one piece of advice.
First, I'd have to step back and ask themselves, what are they struggling with? Got to figure out, is it finance telling you no? Is it because they don't know how to go make the ask? Is it because sales leadership isn't giving it to you? Is it because HR? You got to figure out, why is it that they're struggling? So if it's finance, they got to put themselves in the lens of finance, and you got to show the ROI that your team brings. If you're not focusing on the ROI, just like in pre-sales, when you go to give a demo or you're doing a guided evaluation, what are you looking for? What is the ROI that we are bringing to the customer? So what's the ROI that we're bringing to finance? If you don't have the data, if you haven't proven your ROI to them, it's going to be really frustrating, but don't take it personal.
That right there is enough to give for advice. Greg, I really appreciate you joining the podcast. It's been great talking to you, even before we started recording a couple of weeks ago as well. Really appreciate your time, and thanks for being involved.
Thanks for your time, James. Look forward to many more sessions.
All right, PreSales Collective. I said today was going to be a good episode. I hope Greg did not disappoint. As you heard, he doesn't really like the word justification, but in reality, it's something that we have to do. And this is why PreSales Collective is here to help raise awareness to this profession, raise awareness to what we're doing, and not make this be such a battle. Greg gave us actionable ways that we can build that relationship with finance. You can build a relationship with the CFO, and you can use data to walk people through exactly why you're asking. And Greg gave us that advice at the end. He talked about why. Why do you need headcount? I could tell you as a junior manager at a startup, when I was trying to justify headcount, I had all the data, but I didn't always have the why. And it's a really good reminder that we need that information. We also need our sales counterparts to help go to bat for us. We need to be able to have the data to say, hey, we want to be able to support more, but we can't, and here's why. And getting that aligned approach to go to the finance team and say, this is the ratio that I'm looking for is extremely important. I really love that Greg talked about showing ROI to the business because the CFO looks at the situation as money out the door. So what is the yield on the return? And I also like the question about headcount and cost. As I mentioned, I've seen in my experience where it's all about headcount, but if you have a very expensive person compared to a very junior person, how do you justify that? How do you ensure that maybe you're getting that 2-to-1 ratio that someone like Todd Jansen talks about in many of his conversations? And lastly, one of the things that made an impact on me is the political capital, the aspect of political capital going around being part of the GSD team. And when you need to make that ask, you can make that ask. I want to thank Greg for his time today. I know that PreSales Collective will be focusing on this topic much more in 2021. As always, like, share, give me some feedback. You know I love feedback. Otherwise, we will see you next week.